Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are taking on, well, a truly monumental work of 20th century thought. F.A. Hayek's The Constitution of Liberty. It came out in 1960.
And it's really more than just a political book, isn't it? It feels like a complete architecture for what a free society actually is.
Absolutely. And you have to remember the context, like you said, 1960, height of the Cold War.
Right. Socialism, central planning, the idea of the managed economy, these were really intellectually dominant, even in the West. Hayek wasn't just pushing back, he was building this whole alternative foundation.
Yeah, and he felt, I think, that the purely economic debate was, well, maybe not over, but the groundwork was laid. He and his mentor, Ludwig von Mises, they'd already made this really powerful case that socialist central planning just couldn't work.
That it was fundamentally impossible, because without market prices, those signals telling you what things are really worth, moment to moment, how could a central planner possibly know where to allocate resources efficiently?
Exactly. It just leads to chaos, misallocation, what Mises called planned chaos, actually.
Right. Hayek called it malinvestment and disorder. So for Hayek, the idea that communist systems would eventually crumble wasn't just wishful thinking. It was kind of baked into their design and inevitability.
So that understanding sort of freed him up in the Constitution of Liberty. He could move beyond just critiquing socialism and ask a much bigger question.
Which is?
If central planning is doomed, what exactly is this liberty, this free society that we're trying to define and defend? What does it actually look like?
So the book really zooms out. It aims to give a systematic account. Hayek felt that the decline of liberty often starts when we lose a, quote, clear conception of our aims. We forget what we're even fighting for.
And that's our mission for this deep dive, really, to try and distill Hayek's core ideas from this pretty dense book. We want to look at his definitions, this idea he has about society evolving, and his pretty stark warnings.
Warnings about trading freedom for what he saw as the illusion of security and the dangers of letting bureaucrats take over.
Exactly. So let's start where Hayek starts, with the definition. What does he actually mean by freedom or liberty?
Yeah, let's get into that. He's very precise.
Okay, so Hayek is famously careful with his words. Right at the start, he makes a key distinction. He's mostly focused on what he calls individual or personal freedom, sometimes civil liberty. He separates that from political liberty. Why does he do that?
It's crucial because they're not the same. Political liberty is, your right to vote, participate in choosing the government. Important, yes.
But not the whole picture?
Not at all. You can have elections, you can have participation, but still live under a system where your personal life is heavily controlled. Think of, well, many historical examples. Hayek's defending something deeper.
And that deeper thing, his core definition, it's negative, isn't it? It defines liberty by what's not there.
Exactly. For Hayek, liberty is the state where a person is not subject to coercion by the arbitrary will of another or others. Simple as that, almost. Freedom from.
Freedom from being pushed around by someone else's arbitrary decisions. So if that's liberty, we need to understand its opposite. Coercion. What does he mean by that? It's central to his whole argument.
It really is. And it's broader than just, physical violence or direct threats. He defines coercion as control of the environment or circumstances of a person by another, in such a way that it forces them to act not according to their own plan or goals, but to serve the ends of another.
That's quite encompassing. So give me an example, like your illustration earlier, the person controlling the only water source.
That's a classic Hayekian example. If I control the only oasis and say, work for me for nothing, or you get no water, I haven't physically touched you, but I've manipulated your circumstances so radically that your only real choice is to serve my ends. That's coercion.
Even without a direct command in the traditional sense, it's about manipulating the choices available.
Precisely. And the impact for Hayek is profound. It strikes at the core of what it means to be human. Coercion, he says, eliminates an individual as a thinking and valuing person and makes him a bare tool in the achievement of the ends of another.
Wow. A bare tool. It strips away your agency, your ability to use your own mind and judgment.
It's a fundamental loss of dignity. You're no longer pursuing your life based on your knowledge and values. You're just executing someone else's script.
Okay, so if coercion is the great evil, freedom requires what? Some kind of protected space?
Yes. A known, predictable, protected sphere. You need to know there's an area of your life, your property, your decisions within certain boundaries where others cannot just arbitrarily change the rules or manipulate your environment to force your hand. You need some certainty.
Which brings us straight to the government, the state, because the state holds the biggest stick, right? The monopoly on legitimate force.
The biggest potential coercer, exactly. So the paradox is, how do you justify the state using coercion itself? Police, courts, taxes. These are coercive.
And Hayek's answer is very specific, very limited.
Extremely limited. The state's threat for coercion is justified only if its aim is to prevent coercion by private individuals or groups. Its job is to stop you from coercing me and me from coercing you. That's it.
So the state uses coercion solely to minimize overall coercion in society, a defensive role.
A defensive role, exactly. But then the immediate question is, what stops the state itself from becoming the primary source of arbitrary coercion? If it starts using its power for other goals, for shaping society according to some plan.
That's the tightrope, and his answer is the rule of law.
Yes, this is absolutely fundamental for Hayek. If government power is bound by rules that are general, predictable, and impartial.
Meaning they apply to everyone equally, including the government agents themselves.
Correct. And crucially, you need to be able to know them in advance and predict how they'll be applied. If those conditions are met, then when the state does act coercively, like arresting a criminal, it's not arbitrary. It's according to known, stable rules.
These rules define the boundaries of that protected private sphere we talked about.
They do. So let's take your example. If the government suddenly declares that everyone named John has to work extra hours for some greater good.
Even if it's passed by Parliament or Congress?
It fails the test. It's not general, target specific people. It's likely not predictable in its application, and it's certainly not impartial. It's an arbitrary command disguised as law.
So for Hayek, law isn't just anything the legislature passes. True law has these inherent qualities.
Absolutely. If law becomes merely a tool for the government to achieve specific short-term ends, directing particular people to do particular things, then liberty collapses. You're back to being subject to the arbitrary will of others, in this case, the administrators or the legislators. Your security rests on their goodwill, not the law's certainty.
This idea of limiting the nature of law itself is huge. It really sets the stage for everything else he talks about.
And it connects directly to his next major theme, this evolutionary view of how societies actually develop and function, why we should trust organic growth over top-down design.
Right. This is where he gets into the philosophy of history and society. He aligns himself with what he calls the true individualist tradition. People like Adam Smith, David Hume, Adam Ferguson with the Scottish Enlightenment thinkers.
And it's not individualism in the sense of, atomized individuals doing whatever they want. It's about understanding that complex social structures emerge from the interactions of individuals acting on their own limited knowledge.
The core concept here is spontaneous order, sometimes called catalaxy in economics. It's this, frankly, mind-bending idea that many of the most important human institutions weren't designed by anyone.
Exactly. Think about language. Did a committee invent English, or money, or markets, or even complex systems of law and morality? Hayek says no. They arose and functioned without a designing and directing mind.
He loves that Adam Ferguson quote, doesn't he? Nations stumble upon establishments which are indeed the result of human action, but not the result of human design.
It perfectly captures it. We act, we pursue our goals, we interact under certain rules, and out of those millions of interactions, complex and beneficial orders emerge that no single person intended or could have planned.
Like a forest ecosystem, maybe. No single tree planned the forest, but the interaction creates this incredibly complex, functioning system.
That's a good analogy. Hayek says this spontaneous collaboration of free men often creates things which are greater than their individual minds can comprehend. And this leads him to a really important point about knowledge.
This seems key. It's not just about action, it's about what people know.
It is. The argument for freedom for Hayek is fundamentally an argument about human ignorance. The simple fact that knowledge is radically dispersed.
Right. His concept of dispersed knowledge, we tend to think of knowledge as, scientific facts in a textbook or data in a central computer.
Formal, explicit knowledge. But Hayek emphasizes the importance of the ever-changing particular facts that man continually uses. The knowledge of time and place.
What does that mean practically?
Well, think about running a small shop. You know which customer prefers which brand, when deliveries usually arrive, which shelf placement works best right now, how local traffic affects your footfall today. That's specific, local, temporary knowledge.
Knowledge that no central planner in an office hundreds of miles away could possibly possess or keep up with.
Impossible. It's scattered among millions of individuals. The engineer knows physics, yes, but only the farmer knows the conditions in his field today. Only the trader knows the subtle shifts in market sentiment this morning.
And this is why the free market is so crucial for Hayek. Not because it's fair in some moral sense, but because it's a mechanism for using this dispersed knowledge.
Exactly. It's a discovery procedure. It's a communication system. Prices, profits, losses. These are signals that constantly aggregate and transmit this scattered information, allowing individuals to adapt their plans based on realities far beyond their direct experience.
Acting on their particular knowledge, always unique, as he puts it. And this leads to a better overall adaptation, even if nobody planned it.
Yes, the price of coffee reflects weather in Colombia, shipping delays, changing taste in Europe, all implicitly, without anyone needing to know all the details. Now contrast this evolutionary spontaneous order view with what Hayek sees as its main intellectual rival, the rationalist tradition.
The tradition that believes society can and should be consciously designed and controlled.
Precisely. He traces it back to thinkers like Descartes, who admired societies like ancient Sparta because they seemed planned, designed by a single mind for a single purpose. Rationalists look at messy, evolved traditions or the apparent chaos of the market and see only inefficiency.
Things to be swept away and replaced with a logical, scientific, centrally administered plan.
Right. The assumption is that human reason can grasp the whole system and redesign it for the better. But Hayek sees this as incredibly dangerous. He argues that people who believe all useful institutions must be conscious creations are almost necessarily enemies of freedom.
Why necessarily? That sounds strong.
Because if you believe society requires conscious design, then someone has to be the designer. Someone has to be in charge, directing everyone else according to the grand plan.
And that requires overriding individual plans and knowledge. It requires coercion.
Exactly. The very premise leads to an authoritarian structure, even if the stated goals are benevolent, like equality or efficiency. It dismisses the value of evolved, undesigned systems.
Which includes things like tradition and morality. He puts a lot of weight on those, doesn't he? Things that aren't logically derived.
A huge amount. He insists that freedom has never worked historically without deeply ingrained moral beliefs. These are the moral rules and traditions: honesty, keeping promises, respecting property, family obligations.
Things we often take for granted.
We do. And Hayek, following Hume, stresses that these rules are not the conclusions of our reason. Nobody sat down and logically deduced the optimal rule for promise-keeping. These rules evolved over centuries through trial and error because groups that adopted them tended to survive and prosper.
They are social technologies, in a way. Undesigned conventions and habits that make society predictable and reduce conflict.
Precisely. And here's the crucial link back to coercion. If people voluntarily follow these unwritten rules most of the time, you don't need the state constantly stepping in with its coercive power to enforce order.
So well-established traditions actually minimize the need for state intervention.
Yes, which means the rationalist impulse to tear down tradition because it seems illogical or inefficient is a direct threat to liberty. It destroys the social glue that holds things together without constant top-down command, ironically creating the very vacuum that the planners then feel obliged to fill with more rules and more coercion.
It's a fascinating counterintuitive argument that respecting tradition, even the parts we don't fully understand, can be essential for maintaining freedom. Okay, so if society works best as a spontaneous order, using dispersed knowledge, the results are going to be unpredictable and, inevitably, unequal. This brings us to a really challenging part of Hayek's thought, his critique of social justice and equality.
This is definitely where Hayek pushes back hard against prevailing sentiments, both then and now. He draws a very sharp line between two kinds of equality. First, there's the classical liberal ideal, equality before the law. This means the rules of the game are the same for everyone, general, impartial laws that don't favor specific people or groups.
Okay, the law applies equally to rich and poor, powerful and weak.
In principle, yes. Now contrast that with the modern demand for social justice, which Hayek usually equates with equality of outcome or material equality.
To make sure everyone ends up in roughly the same economic position.
Right. And Hayek argues these two are fundamentally incompatible. If you have genuine liberty people free to use their diverse skills and luck within fair rules, the results will inevitably be unequal. Some ventures will succeed wildly, others will fail. Some skills will be highly valued at one time, others less so.
So liberty produces inequality of outcomes.
It must, he argues, because individuals are different, circumstances change, and luck plays a huge role. Trying to force equal outcomes requires abandoning equality before the law.
How so?
Because to make outcomes equal, the state has to treat people unequally. It has to take from some to give to others. It has to intervene constantly based on who is deemed too successful or not successful enough. Law stops being a set of general rules for conduct and becomes a tool for redistribution.
It shifts from impartial rules to, as he puts it, political discretion. Some official or committee has to decide who gets what, who deserves help, whose success is excessive.
Exactly. And that discretion is inherently arbitrary, opening the door to favoritism, lobbying, and the very coercion the rule of law was meant to prevent.
But surely there's a strong moral case for trying to reduce vast inequalities. Think about that famous quote from Anatole France he discusses.
Yes, the majestic equality quote. It's incredibly powerful rhetoric.
Remind us.
France scoffs at the law's supposed impartiality, noting its majestic equality that forbids the rich as well as the poor to sleep under bridges, to beg in the streets, and to steal bread.
It brilliantly highlights how formal legal equality can seem like a cruel joke when people's starting points are so vastly different.
It does. It resonates deeply. But Hayek, while acknowledging the emotional power, sees this line of argument as incredibly dangerous. He thinks it undermines the very possibility of impartial justice.
Why? Because it demands the law achieve a specific result. Less poverty, more equality, rather than just setting fair rules.
Precisely. If the law's job is to correct for differences in wealth or circumstance, it has to stop being general and impartial. It has to start treating unequal people unequally to achieve an equal outcome. The judge or the legislator has to start making specific value judgments about who deserves what based on their economic status.
And once you go down that road, where does it stop? Who decides the correct level of equality? It becomes political.
It becomes entirely political. The law ceases to be a shield for individual freedom and becomes a weapon in the fight over distribution. This leads him to another crucial distinction regarding why people get paid what they do. The difference between merit and value.
Okay, let's unpack that. Merit versus value.
Merit, for Hayek, is about the moral worthiness of an action. How much effort did someone put in? How virtuous were their intentions? How much sacrifice did it involve?
Things we often think should be rewarded. Hard work, dedication, good character.
Exactly. But value, in the economic sense Hayek uses it, is different. Value is simply the usefulness of a person's actions or services to others as judged by those others in the marketplace. It's about supply and demand, utility, what people are willing to pay for.
And his point is that in a free market system, people are remunerated based on value, not merit.
Yes. The market is, in a sense, morally blind. It doesn't care how hard you tried or whether you're a good person. It only cares about whether the outcome of your effort is useful to others right now.
So the highly skilled artisan making something beautiful that few people want, high merit, low market value, might earn less than someone who stumbles upon a lucky invention or caters to a popular, perhaps even frivolous demand, low merit, high market value.
That's the reality of it. Hayek says the fact that a result is extremely useful to others, the fact that there is little merit in it, does not make it any less valuable to the market.
And trying to make the system reward merit instead of value.
Yeah.
That's impossible, right?
He argues it's not only practically impossible who could possibly judge the true moral merit of everyone's efforts accurately, but also profoundly undesirable. It would require an omniscient, likely tyrannical authority to assess everyone's inner state and intentions.
But beyond the impossibility, he has another argument against rewarding merit, a psychological one.
Yes, and it's quite subtle. He suggests that a society where everyone believed that income directly reflected moral merit would actually be more cruel and psychologically damaging to those who are less successful.
How so?
Think about it. If you live in a society that constantly tells you wealth is proof of virtue and hard work, and you find yourself struggling financially, what does that imply about you?
That you're lazy or undeserving or morally deficient in some way.
Exactly. The burden of failure becomes crushing. But in a society that acknowledges income is largely based on value, which includes luck, timing, and morally arbitrary factors, you can fail financially without necessarily losing your self-respect. You can say, okay, the market didn't value my skills right now, or I was unlucky, without it being a judgment on your moral worth.
So the market's very impersonality, its indifference to merit, paradoxically protects individual dignity in failure.
That's Hayek's counterintuitive claim. It preserves a space for self-worth that a merit-obsessed system would destroy. which leads into his stark conclusion about distributive justice.
Which is?
That once you accept that a free society produces unpredictable and unequal outcomes based on value, not merit, then the whole question of whether the resulting pattern of income distribution is just or unjust becomes meaningless. Justice, for Hayek, applies to human conduct are the rules under which people act fair and impartial. It cannot apply to an unintended outcome of a process involving millions of people, luck, and changing circumstances. You can't call the overall distribution unjust any more than you could call the outcome of a fair race unjust just because someone came in last. Justice lies in the rules of the game, not the final score.
Okay, so we've seen Hayek's case for liberty as absence of coercion, his belief in spontaneous order, and his critique of social justice aiming for equal outcomes. Now we turn to what he saw, even in 1960, as the most pressing practical threat to this entire system.
Yes, the rise of the administrative or bureaucratic state, often fueled by the desire for security.
This is where his analysis feels incredibly relevant today, looking at modern regulation and welfare systems. He identifies the biggest danger not as some evil dictator, but who?
The efficient expert administrators, people genuinely dedicated to the public good, as they see it, specialists in housing, healthcare, labor markets, environment.
Why are they the danger? Isn't expertise a good thing?
It can be, but Hayek's worry is that their very focus on achieving specific desirable outcomes like affordable housing for all or a perfectly clean environment leads them to override the general rules of law.
Because achieving those specific outcomes requires treating different cases differently. It requires discretion.
Exactly. It inevitably leads away from the rule of law general, predictable rules, towards the rule of bureaucrats. The expert administrator needs the power to make judgments, grant exceptions, impose conditions on a case-by-case basis to achieve their specific target. Predictability vanishes.
And you, the citizen, are no longer operating under known laws, but are subject to the decisions and interpretations of unelected officials.
Yes. Hayek saw the modern welfare state creating this self-willed and uncontrollable apparatus before which the individual is helpless. You become less an independent citizen under law and more a client dependent on the agency's funding, rules, and goodwill.
He connects this to a historical shift in how we even understand the rule of law.
He does. He argues that historically, concepts like the rule of law or the German Rechtsstaat were substantive. They meant that laws had to have certain inherent qualities, generality, certainty, fairness, that limited what government could legitimately do.
Law was a constraint on government power.
Yes, but he saw legal positivism, especially gaining ground in Europe, emptying this concept of its substance. It became purely formal. Meaning law simply became whatever the properly constituted legislature enacted. As long as the procedure was followed, anything could be called law, even if it was a specific order targeting one person or granting vast arbitrary power to an agency.
So legality replaced law in the old sense?
Precisely. And this shift has huge consequences. It means that having procedural safeguards, like the right to appeal an administrative decision, might be useless if the underlying law itself gives the administrator total discretion.
If the law says the minister can decide X based on what he thinks is best, an appeal court can only check if the minister did decide. It can't easily challenge the substance of the decision if the law grants that arbitrary power.
Correct. As Hayek puts it, procedural safeguards are powerless to protect justice where the law deliberately leaves the decision to the discretion of authority. The arbitrariness is built into the legal structure itself.
And a primary driver for expanding this discretionary administrative power is the popular demand for security.
Yes, the lure of security. Hayek is careful here. He concedes that some compulsory measures might be justified to ensure a basic minimum, preventing people from becoming burdens on others. He mentions things like compulsory basic insurance.
A minimal safety net, perhaps?
Perhaps, but he immediately warns that social insurance programs almost inevitably grow far beyond that minimal level. They tend to become vast, monolithic, state-run monopolies.
Why? What drives that expansion?
Partly arguments about efficiency and standardization, but Hayek identifies a deeper systemic issue, the rise of the institutional expert.
The specialists we mentioned earlier.
Yes, the people who dedicate their careers to understanding and running these complex systems, Social Security, National Health Services, etc. Hayek observes that these experts almost invariably become advocates for the system they administer.
Their expertise is in the system, so they naturally favor its continuation and expansion.
It's almost unavoidable. He says the expert is unhesitatingly in favor of the institutions on which he is expert. Their professional identity, their knowledge base, their influence are all tied to the system's importance. They become an internal lobby for more growth, often genuinely believing it's necessary.
And this connects to what he calls the propaganda danger, which sounds quite alarming.
It is a very pointed critique. Because these state-run systems are usually funded by compulsory contributions, taxes, or mandatory insurance payments, they have access to huge sums of money.
Our money.
Our money. And Hayek points out that these agencies then use these compulsory funds to essentially run propaganda campaigns in favor of their own expansion.
So the Social Security Agency uses taxpayer money to convince taxpayers and politicians that the Social Security system needs to be bigger, more comprehensive, and that any cuts are dangerous.
That's the core of the critique. They have a state-funded platform to shape public opinion, arguing for the necessity and virtues of the very compulsory system they administer. It creates a feedback loop where the system promotes its own growth, potentially manipulating public opinion far beyond what people would choose if presented with neutral information or genuine alternatives.
It crowds out dissenting views and makes objective debate about the system's size or scope very difficult.
Very difficult indeed. It undermines genuine democratic consent, in his view. And finally, all this ties back to the individual's character through the relationship between freedom and responsibility.
The idea that security comes at a cost.
A profound moral cost. Promises of security, guaranteed jobs, stable incomes, protection from all of life's risks necessarily reduce individual independence and the need to take responsibility for one's own life.
If the state guarantees my outcome, why should I strive, adapt, or take risks?
Exactly. Hayek argues that facing uncertainty, bearing the responsibility for your own choices and their consequences, is essential for human dignity and growth. He insists the pressure of freedom, the anxiety of making your own way, is preferable to the far more invidious pressure of personal orders that one must obey.
Better the insecurity of freedom than the security of dependence.
That's his stark choice. When people are shielded from the consequences of their actions, they lose not only responsibility, but also the dignity that comes from overcoming challenges and providing for oneself. They become, in a sense, perpetual wards of the state.
It's a demanding view of freedom. It requires courage, resilience, a willingness to accept risk.
And that really brings us to the core moral summation of the book, doesn't it? It's not just about economics or political structures. For Hayek, freedom is the essential precondition for morality itself.
How so? Why is freedom necessary for virtue?
Because morality requires choice. You can only be considered virtuous or responsible if you have the freedom to choose otherwise. If you are simply following orders or compelled by the system to act in a certain way,
then there's no moral content to your actions. You're just complying.
Precisely. He argues that only free individuals can truly act morally, because only they face genuine choices between right and wrong, good and bad, wise and foolish. A society that tries to engineer virtue by removing difficult choices and risks
ends up eliminating the possibility of virtue itself. It produces subjects, not responsible citizens.
And that's why he says a free society actually demands more than any other that people be guided in their action by a sense of responsibility which extends beyond the duties exacted by the law. It relies heavily on those internal moral compasses, those unwritten rules we discussed earlier.
The traditions and habits of responsibility that the rationalist planner might dismiss. So the enduring message seems to be that liberty is incredibly valuable, but also incredibly fragile.
And threatened not just by obvious tyrants, but perhaps even more so by well-intentioned reformers, by the experts who believe they can design a better, safer, more equal world through centralized control.
Hayek insists that the rule of law, limited government, spontaneous order, these aren't roadblocks to progress. They are the necessary framework for genuine, sustainable progress.
And his final stance is one of profound humility about our ability to direct society, as he famously put it. The liberal, in his sense of the word, neither wants to direct nor to be directed. He desires freedom for all.
The goal isn't to impose a specific outcome, but to maintain the conditions where everyone can pursue their own goals.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. Hayek puts enormous stress on those unwritten rules, the customs, traditions, social norms that make a free society function by reducing the need for state coercion. These are often invisible, taken for granted.
Much harder to articulate and defend than formal laws. So consider this. What aspects of our daily lives, our interactions in the market, our public discourse rely heavily on these unspoken evolved conventions? Think about trust, basic civility, tolerance perhaps. And what happens to our society, to our need for formal regulation and state intervention when those unwritten rules start to break down?
When the spontaneous order erodes, what takes its place? A crucial question stemming directly from Hayek's concerns.
A challenging thought indeed. Well, that's about all the time we have. You've been listening to The Deep Dive from Wake Up and Smell the Freedom, where ideas percolate. Thanks for joining us as we continue to explore the ideas that shape liberty and continue to shape us today. Remember, the pursuit of liberty begins with understanding, and understanding begins with asking the right questions. Until next time.
Bye-bye.